So we need to talk about some critical decisions which struck down state rifle and magazine bans, and those cases are now up on appeal. So let's break down what is happening in these critical cases. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is 1st Phorm. 1st Phorm's an amazing company. They have great supplements. I use their protein powder every single day when I work out. And also the great thing about them is they're pro-freedom, pro-America, and they support the Second Amendment and what we do here on the channel. So if you want to check out the amazing supplements they have, you can use the link down below. And if you order something from them, if it's $50 or more, you can get a free 4-pack of energy drinks. So thank you again to 1st Phorm for sponsoring and supporting this two-way content. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about what is now happening in the critical cases which are challenging the state of Illinois' ban on so-called assault weapons, and then also the state's magazine ban as well. This involves, those critical challenges to these type of state restrictions that are put in place by states like Illinois, and then you have some like California, New York, New Jersey, all of these states that put in place these bans on so-called assault weapons and magazines. This is one of those critical challenges that's moving its way. It's in the 7th Circuit, and now we finally have the appellate court here moving these cases along towards a final resolution. Now, you may recall that recently we got a huge decision from the District Court Judge, Judge McGlynn, who struck down the Protect Illinois Communities Act, also known as PICA. This all comes off of the Supreme Court recently denying emergency review to these Illinois cases because at that time there were interlocutory appeals, and what happened is the Supreme Court said they did not want to get involved. And despite that, you still had the lower court judge that moved them towards a final resolution, and ultimately on review on the final merits, he struck down the law in its entirety. However, Illinois has now appealed this case up to the 7th Circuit, and we all know that the biased 7th Circuit has once again decided to help the state of Illinois in their restriction on these types of rifles and magazines, and they decided to grant a stay of the lower court's decision. Now, after that, there was kind of a stall in this case. It wasn't really moving forward. The 7th Circuit was kind of sitting on it a little bit, but now the 7th Circuit has finally set briefing in these cases, and finally the PICA issue is once again moving forward. However, we also have the looming Snope and Ocean State tactical cases that are currently in front of the Supreme Court, which are reviews of very similar state bans on rifles and magazines, and those cases could drastically impact the outcome of what happens here in the state of Illinois. Now, you may recall in these PICA cases, originally you had some district courts issue preliminary injunctions against various aspects and against the enforcement of PICA. However, the state of Illinois appealed those preliminary injunctions to the 7th Circuit, and on review, a liberal and biased 3-judge panel in the 7th Circuit overruled the granting of those preliminary injunctions. Now, in coming to those decisions, the 7th Circuit concluded that the arms protected by the Second Amendment do not include weapons that may be reserved for military use. So they use something known as the military use test, which again does not align with what the Supreme Court has said in their decisions. That then led all of these cases for the first time to seek immediate emergency intervention from the Supreme Court. But like I mentioned, the Supreme Court at the end of their last term denied review to all of these cases on an emergency basis. And that really was because the justices there did not want to review any interlocutory or preliminary injunction cases. Now, there was a denial from Justice Thomas, and in that denial, he stated that if the 7th Circuit ultimately allows Illinois to ban America's most common civilian rifle, we can and should review that decision once the cases reach a final judgment. The court must not permit the 7th Circuit to relegate the Second Amendment to a second-class right. So although the Supreme Court denied review to those cases, you did have Justice Thomas who wrote a statement, and he stated that there was an interest in these type of rifle ban cases, but they wanted something on the final merits. Now, while again those preliminary injunction emergency applications were going on, Judge McGlynn moved this same case towards a final merits decision. Judge McGlynn ruled in favor of the plaintiffs here against PICA and found that PICA is unconstitutional and it violates the Second Amendment. However, in that decision, he stayed the enforcement of his order for 30 days so that the state of Illinois could appeal to the 7th Circuit and seek a more permanent stay from the 7th Circuit. Illinois, of course, did appeal, and they requested a stay from the 7th Circuit, which they did receive. In their motion, the state of Illinois argued that the district court for the second time in 2 years entered an injunction prohibiting the enforcement of Illinois statute on a statewide basis. The court's decision is badly flawed, and its injunction should be stayed pending appeal. The opinion below fails to faithfully apply this court's decision in Bevis. Indeed, it repeatedly criticized Bevis. It cannot be squared with the Supreme Court's precedent or the uniform decisions of the courts of appeals applying such precedent, and it would threaten public safety by permitting military-grade weapons to proliferate again in Illinois. So the state's primary argument is that the judge there, Judge McGlynn, misapplied Bruin and the Seventh Circuit's decision in Beavis, and because of that, the decision should be stayed outright. Now, on review, the Seventh Circuit panel agreed and granted the stay in favor of the state of Illinois and put a halt on what Judge McGlynn said. There was also some interesting developments where you had the Seventh Circuit say that Judge McGlynn's decision down below was deficient in some way, it wasn't clear, and it needed to go back to him for some clarifications, and he needed to clean up that order. Now, after the appeal and the grant of the stay, the PICA challenges kind of stalled out for a bit. We weren't really getting any movement in these cases at all because the Seventh Circuit was kind of sitting on them. But now we have an order from the Seventh Circuit setting the timeline for arguments to take place in this case. Illinois will now need to file their brief by May 7th, and the responses from the plaintiffs and the various organizations will be due on June 6th and then also June 27th. So there's different pockets of plaintiffs, and they're going to have different responses that they need to file. So finally, you have Illinois in this PICA challenge once again moving forward towards a final merits decision in the Seventh Circuit. Now, I will say that it's important that we keep our eyes also on what's going on currently in the Supreme Court, in the Snope challenge, in the Ocean State tactical case. That's because those cases are also, at least the Snope case is on the final merits, and it's a case dealing with the Maryland state rifle ban, which is very similar in nature to what's going on here in Illinois. The Fourth Circuit used a similar analysis, finding that rifles are useful in military service and therefore could be banned. Snope has been relisted 10 times now for conference, and it's still up in the air whether or not the Supreme Court is actually going to grant review to those cases, or maybe they're going to issue something like a per curiam opinion. We don't really know. Very strange that they've been relisted that many times. But of course, what happens in the Supreme Court with the Snope case, because it's so similar to what's going on here in the state of Illinois, it will drastically impact and directly kind of change maybe the direction of what happens in the Seventh Circuit. Now, when it comes to the Snope case, we really should have an answer, before June, and the outcome of that will probably directly impact what happens here in the PICA challenges. If the Supreme Court denies review to the Snope case, there really will be little hope that not only will the Seventh Circuit rule in a pro-2A way, but also that after that, will there even be an ability to go to the Supreme Court for review of the Illinois cases? Because if they've already rejected the Snope case on the final merits dealing with similar issues, decisions, analysis, it's very unlikely that they would then grant review suddenly to the Illinois case. That's why the Snope case is so important, because it could be the whole ball game kind of for the foreseeable future on whether or not the Supreme Court will actually consider rifle and magazine ban cases. Regardless, the Seventh Circuit now has control of these cases, and if you're going to ask my opinion, I think that it's going to be kind of the same from the Seventh Circuit. They're anti-gun, and I think they're going to rule the same way. Because of that, any immediate relief will now need to come from the Supreme Court, probably from the Snope case or the Ocean State tactical case. So we're really going to be keeping our eyes on that, because that will also impact what's going on here in Illinois, but other states like California as well that have similar rifle magazine ban cases. The magazine ban case in the Duncan was recently decided by the Ninth Circuit en banc panel. That's probably going to be elevated to the Supreme Court, but you also have things like the Miller case that have been sitting in the Ninth Circuit for a long time that will drastically impact what happens with rifles in California. So a lot of this is interplaying, a lot of this is tied in, but at least finally when it comes to the Seventh Circuit, they're moving these Illinois PICA cases along towards some briefing. So we're going to be watching all this closely. As I get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.